first and foremost I want to emphasize about this presentation, it is a history, but I'm sure you guys have all sat through history of Israel at some point. Really what this is, it's history from an activism perspective, okay? That's the point of this. It's not just here are the facts, but it's really also here's sometimes what people say, and so here's what actually happened, and that will, do you mind just closing the door? Thank you. So oftentimes what happens is people say things, and if we've never heard the false claim, then we don't know the correct thing to say in response to it. So what I'm going to try to do often is throughout the history say, this is important because people are saying X, and this is the fact that shows that that's not the case, okay? So it really is history, but from an activism perspective, all right? So let's dive right in. I always start with maps. It's probably because I was raised in the United States and traumatized by my geographical upbringing where I can barely put my own states on the map. So I always like to start with maps, kind of orient us into the Middle East and where Israel is. I always start with a zoomed out map also because, guys, people just, when we zoom in on Israel, it's very hard to see Israel in context. It's very hard to see actually how small Israel is when we see Israel all zoomed in. When you zoom out and you kind of see Israel in relation to the region, we get an idea of how small actually Israel really is. And that becomes significant all of a sudden because the smaller we are, the harder it is for us to defend ourselves. And that's a big issue when we talk about Israel's size. So let's zoom in on Israel and quickly highlight that for a second. Now, again, I know you guys probably know this stuff, but when it comes to Israel, we have to be able to explain to somebody who comes from a country like the United States. Any Canadians? Somebody comes from the United States or from Canada or other bigger countries, that Israel is just really, really small, right? So in the US, we always say that it's the size of New Jersey, right? That's the comparison, right? If you're from California, a great example, a great a great thing that you can use is that Israel's the size of San Bernardino County. In fact, San Bernardino County is actually larger than the state of Israel. Any Midwesterners in the house? Yeah, so you've got that Israel fits inside of Lake Michigan twice, okay? It fits inside of Texas like, I want to say like 40 some odd times. And the craziest thing of Texas, I'm pretty sure there's a ranch in Texas whose territory is larger than the state of Israel, okay? That's, I think, the big one for Texas. That's a good one. And guys, all over the world we do this, right? If you're in the UK, it's the size of Wales. If you're in South Africa, Kruger National Park is bigger than the state of Israel, okay? And all of a sudden, what you do is you allow somebody to get perspective for a second and to really try to put themselves in a country this small. Other things that you can say, obviously, is how long it takes for Israel for you to drive from the top to the bottom, right? It takes about 6 hours to drive across the country at its longest point. At its narrowest point, which is 9 miles wide, if you don't include the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, you can drive across it in maybe 10, 15 minutes tops, all right? It is a very small country. And guys, that means that it also is very hard to defend. You can have a very simple, a terrorist organization with very simple missiles or rockets sitting on any one of your borders, and with those, they can reach much of the country and the heart of the country. And that's become a challenge for us. And on top of that, we also have to get into that mindset of if you're a soldier in Israel, you know, you're not being sent 8,000 miles away to a different country to defend your country or your family. You're oftentimes, you know, called up, and in an hour you go from being a civilian to being a soldier, and you find yourself in a war zone. And you're literally fighting in your backyard. And when you see rockets going over your heads, you understand that those rockets are headed towards your family and your friends. This conflict is much more personal and much more intimate than what we've seen in other conflicts in the world today and historically, okay? Now, the other thing to talk about when looking at the map is topography. Topography plays a role in this conflict as well. Because of how small Israel is, high ground becomes very strategic. Low ground is unfortunately can put you in a very precarious situation. So when we look at Israel, if you kind of take a piece of paper and fold it in half, that's kind of what Israel looks like topographically, where the center of the country is high ground, and then on either side, or the center of the territory, I should say, is high ground, and then on either side, you have flat land, right? You have the mountains of Jerusalem that we're sitting in now, the Judean mountains, or the Samaritan mountains in the north, and then they slope down and really cliff off into the Jordan Valley, right, the lowest point on earth. And then on the other side, you have it where it's mountains that kind of go into hills that slope down casually into the coastal plain of Israel, where about 70% of our population sits, guys, in places like Herzliya, Tel Aviv, Rishon LeZion, etc. And this is an issue because as I'm sure we know, when we talk about Israel, we talk about the conflict. One of the territories that is the most disputed, probably in the world today, is the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. This is a territory that is high ground. So on top of the fact that it's disputed because there is religious significance for Jews in that area, as well as for Muslims, and there is historic significance to that territory to Jews and to Palestinians, and then add in a whole nother layer, which is even Jews who live in Israel who don't care at all about the religious connection to this land still will say from a strategic standpoint, we need to be very careful about when and how we give up this territory if we are going to do that. Because we have to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a position where you have a Hamas terrorist sitting on a hilltop in the West Bank with perfect view of, let's say, our airport, which only sits 4 miles from the line that surrounds the West Bank, which is the Green Line, with a perfect view of a runway, where if he just had an RPG or an anti-aircraft missile on his shoulder, he could then take out an incoming or outgoing aircraft from Ben Gurion, which is a genuine, real threat that could be our reality, guys. And so when we talk about moving forward, how to make peace, how to compromise, what should we do, these are things that we also need to take into consideration. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it's definitely something that has to be part of the conversation, okay? That's topography. That also is the same case up in the Golan, right? The Golan Heights being a high ground that looks down on the Hula Valley, where the Sea of Galilee, where the Kinneret is. So that's another issue as well. The Golan Heights also being a contentious territory in this conflict. Now, real quick, let's just look at our borders, because guys, we're small. We're also in a tough neighborhood. If we were really small and we had great neighbors like Canada, we'd be good, right? Or the Canadians, we're an okay neighbor as America. But if that was the case, none of this would be an issue. But unfortunately, we have faced enemies, and we've been facing enemies and been facing threats since the moment that Israel was established. So let's quickly just talk about modern day what those threats are. Let's start up in Lebanon. Terrorist organization called Hezbollah. They were founded back in 1982, guys. Hezbollah is armed, funded, and trained by Iran. There are literally Hezbollah fighters who go to Iran to train alongside the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, making Hezbollah, guys, quasi-military. Now, they also receive all of their weapons from Iran, so they have one of the largest missile arsenals in the world today. They, at this point, have developed capabilities, from what we understand, that they could potentially be firing 100 missiles into Israel at one time, which would absolutely overwhelm our missile defense system. They've also now escalated their threat against Israel by digging tunnels underneath our border. Last December, we found at least 5 tunnels dug underneath the Israeli border that popped out inside of northern Israeli communities. The goal of Hezbollah was to commit a massive terrorist attack against Israel, and in their words, to cause a major blow to the Israeli psyche. So Hezbollah is an ongoing threat, and an added little piece of the puzzle is that Hezbollah also happens to be a political party in Lebanon, and they are at the moment part of the government. They have 15 seats in the parliament, and they are part of the 71-seat leading coalition in Lebanon today. An active threat, but keep in mind, guys, whenever we talk about Hezbollah, who are we actually talking about? Iran. Because Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. They are basically an arm of Iran. And you always got to be thinking about it that way. They almost never act independently. Let's move on over into Syria. We've had the Syrian conflict now for 8 years. It's basically over. But what's happened is, as a result of it, Bashar al-Assad has stayed in power. Bashar al-Assad also being an ally of Iran. And him staying in power has kept a threat against Israel. Because, guys, we have been at war with Syria pretty much since the founding of the State of Israel. Bashar al-Assad has stated himself to be an enemy of Israel. And so within that area of Syria, we face 3 different threats. The Syrian military themselves. We face the threat of Iran, because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, since that war, has been actively planting infrastructure within that territory. And lastly, we have Hezbollah. Hezbollah, who were sent into Syria to fight alongside Bashar al-Assad. Remember, they're both allies of Iran, so Iran sent in their proxy, and some of them stayed. And what we have now discovered is that Hezbollah actually sits on that northern border today of Israel's, and they're recruiting Syrians to be part of Hezbollah. Okay? We also, by the way, just as a side note, just discovered that Hezbollah is also active in Iraq, trying to topple the current Shiite government to put in a Shiite government that would be Iranian, that would be supportive of Iranian intervention.
What was the second one that you said for Syria?
The Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So Iranian military themselves. Okay? Guys, both these borders have been hot borders, especially the Syrian border. Okay, just in the last few months, we've had projectiles launched into Israel. We've had sirens go off in the north. We've had responses. Israel is constantly engaged in bombing campaigns within Syria for a number of reasons. If we know that weapons are being delivered to Hezbollah, that would be one reason. If we see that Iranian Revolutionary Guard is really embedding more and more of their infrastructure, we usually blow it up. And the same thing, and with the Syrian military, if a projectile comes over into Israel, we will respond in kind. And it's usually against Syrian military. So that's what we have going on in the north. Hot, hot borders today, and we monitor them very closely. We have two borders that are quiet. The Egyptian border and the Jordanian border are quiet today. We made peace with both these countries. We'll talk about when and how that happened. Egypt was not a quiet border always. Within this area of Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula desert, we had hints of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and we still do. That being said, what Israel did a few years ago was we decided to build a southern fence along our southern border to keep out terrorists. And it's been very, very effective. And so that border has returned to be a relatively quiet border today. The Jordanian border has been pretty much quiet since we made peace with the Jordanians, and it remains one until today. Now we got to zoom in to the territory actually between the river and the sea. Let's talk about Gaza. As I'm sure you guys know, we withdrew from the Gaza Strip back in 2005, and again, we'll talk about how that happened. But Israel withdrew entirely all of its forces and settlements from the Gaza Strip. Within 2 years, there was a Hamas takeover. How this happened was in January of 2006, guys, Hamas got elected to be the majority of the Palestinian parliament. They ran alongside a party, or against a party called Fatah, and they won. Now, the problem was that they are a recognized terrorist organization. So after they won, the world, many people throughout the world said to them, listen, we can't legitimize you as a government and have relations with you if you don't do three things. One, recognize Israel. Two, end all violence against Israel. And three, recognize all past agreements with Israel. Hamas refused. And what America and other countries did, they said, we are not going to treat you as the government. We are going to continue to work with Fatah. This then prompted Hamas, within a year and a half, to start a violent coup against Fatah in the Gaza Strip, expelling them basically from Gaza or killing them. I mean, guys, they were literally taking people up to the roofs of buildings and throwing them off at the time. This was basically a civil war that ensued inside of the Gaza Strip. Fatah members literally ran to the border and to the fence of Israel. Israel opened up the fences, let them in, and sent them to the West Bank. So Hamas takes over power in June of 2007, and they've been ruling there ever since. The threats from that territory and from Hamas have escalated. Now, there's also an additional entity in the Gaza Strip that we need to also mention, and that's Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They are very similar to Hamas in ideology, another terrorist organization, and today they are also an Iranian proxy. Hamas used to be backed by Iran, and every so often they warm up to each other again, but mostly Hamas at the moment is being funded by Qatar. And even that, we're seeing that funding starting to run out as well. So what are the threats that we face from Gaza? The first one is rocket fire. We've experienced over 25,000 rockets launched into Israel from the Gaza Strip. Now, guys, when Israel faces a threat, we quell that threat. Yes?
Since when?
2001. We quell the threat. How do we quell the rocket threat? We developed a system called the Iron Dome. I know you've all heard of it. How does it work? When a rocket's launched into Israel, as soon as we detect that motor, our radar detects that motor, the system calculates the trajectory of that rocket. If it's headed towards a populated area or an unpopulated area, we let that rocket fall. If it's headed toward a populated area, we send off 1 or 2 intercepting missiles that are going to blow up alongside that rocket, and then all you have to fear is falling debris, which, by the way, is still a threat. It's just a much more minor threat, which is why even though we have the Iron Dome, people in the south and people, whenever they hear that siren warning of an incoming rocket, they still have to run to shelter. If you're very close to the Gaza Strip, you have up to 15 seconds. And as you get further out from the Gaza Strip, that number will jump by 15 seconds. So in Jerusalem, for example, we have over a minute to find shelter. There are some communities, I got to stress this, right along the Gaza border, guys, that are absolutely not protected by the Iron Dome. They are too close, and more often than not, they don't take rockets, they take mortars. And there is almost no protection from mortar fire. And so let's keep in mind that while we do have this shield, there are some people that this shield does not protect inside of Israel. So that's an ongoing threat. 2 months ago, in May of this year of 2010, we faced A barrage of rockets from Hamas. About 849 missiles were launched into Israel in the span of 36 hours. And we learned something. Hamas also learned something, that they now know how to overwhelm the Iron Dome. They know that if they fire enough missiles into Israel at one time, and they fire them at different altitudes, that some of them will break through the shield. And that is exactly what happened a couple of months ago. And as a result of this, guys, we lost 4 Israelis during that barrage who were murdered from rocket fire. The largest number that we have lost from rocket fire since 2012. And so this was a serious escalation. We managed to quell it with a ceasefire, and we've managed to create some kind of quiet for the summer due to the ceasefires that we've drawn up between us and Hamas at the moment. That's one threat. Second threat are tunnels. Guys, Hamas has actively been digging tunnels underneath Israel's borders since back in the early 2000s and the early aughts. We know this because they kidnapped a soldier through one back in 2006, Gilad Shalit, and they escalated this dramatically after they took over the Gaza Strip. One of the main reasons that 5 years ago Israel launched Operation Protective Edge in the summer of 2014 was for the purpose of entering the Gaza Strip and destroying tunnels at their origins, which we did. Now this also is problematic, guys, because where are the origins of tunnels very often? People's homes, people's bathrooms that were commandeered by Hamas. And so to destroy the tunnel, sometimes you got to destroy the home. And that creates a situation where some people become homeless as a result of this, unfortunately. Yeah.
What was the operation called?
Operation Protective Edge. That was summer 2014, last major operation that Israel has fought, which is actually really a really big deal, guys, because it's been 6 years. And that's, I mean, it's the longest we've gone in many, many years without an operation. I should say like Bli Ayin Hara and knock on wood. The other threats from Gaza, so we talked about tunnels. Guys, they've been actively digging tunnels. We destroyed over 80% of their terror tunnel network. And today we decided that we don't want to go back into the Gaza Strip and do this again. So what Israel decided to do a couple years ago is to dig a subterranean wall. We are at the moment digging a wall that's going to go 40 yards down into the ground. There will be sensors so that if we detect any kind of digging in the vicinity, we will know about it. We will be able to spot it. And guys, when I say this is an ongoing threat, just last week, 2 weeks ago, we actually found a tunnel while we were going down into the ground digging for the wall, and we destroyed it. So this is, again, something that after 2014, Hamas immediately started back up with tunnel digging. So we know this is an ongoing threat. That's why we're actively trying to get that wall in place as soon as possible. So that's the tunnel threat, and that's how we're trying to quell that tunnel threat. Yes? So that's the thing. They're going to have to go further down into the ground, but hopefully with the sensors we'll be able to detect it. But it will, again, I'll say this, and a brilliant mind said this to me last week, Miri Eisen, who used to be spokesperson for the IDF and for the Prime Minister. She said, no matter what we do, nothing is 100%, right? So you have the Iron Dome. It's fantastic. In the last operation, over 90% effective, but it's never going to be 100%, right? We'll dig the wall. It'll be incredibly effective, but it'll never be 100%. There's no such thing, which is how they always are going to work. They're always going to find another way. And what do we do when they find another way? We find another way to stop them. That's the back and forth, right? Guys, the other threat that we're facing today is the balloon threat. Balloon, kite, condom, that's what's been going on in the last year and a half or so, where they have been sending these devices up into the air. They use Mother Nature. They use the wind from the sea to push these things over into Israel. Attached to them are incendiary devices that are set on fire. They fly over into Israel, they fall down on our fields, and they set our fields on fire. We have not found a way to stop this threat. It's a fascinating thing to think about, guys. Oftentimes, Israel is accused of being this big, strong, powerful force, and we are. No one's stopping anyone from saying that we are a military might. But no Apache helicopter or drone is going to be able to help take out balloons or kites from the sky. So we have our military might, and to a certain extent, they use it against us by using very basic things against us, like balloons. And guys, from the psychological standpoint, I want you to also think about it, the psychological torment. One, of people losing their livelihoods because their agricultural fields are burning down. And for kids in the South today, for us, what are balloons? They're this celebratory thing. You get them on your birthday, right? You don't take balloons to a birthday party down south. You don't have balloons down south anymore. For now, for kids in the South, balloons are a new threat. That's the reality, all right? What they have done to try to minimize this threat is all along the Gaza border. there are these little tents set up with civilian volunteers and some soldiers who are there for backup, who sit daily during the day, because they only come over during the day, and they watch. They just watch. Their entire job is to just be looking out to see if they see any balloons. And they immediately, once they see them, they report them so that firefighters can be dispatched very quickly to the direct spot where those balloons are going to land so that we can put out the fires sooner. But stopping them entirely, we have yet to be able to do. Yeah.
Can they not shoot them down?
No. And even if they do, they're already in Israeli territory. So the device is going to fall. You know what I mean? So it's really a matter of trying to put it out before it falls, which we've yet to be able to successfully do. So all we can do is get the dispatch firefighters as soon as possible. Super soakers. I love the ideas that come up, but I imagine the Israeli military is really trying to think of every option, and if they have yet to come up with one, it means that they have yet to figure out the best way. But I'm sure, guys, with those minds, when threats come, we figure out a way, right? The last thing that's been happening from Gaza, which has been a threat, has been the campaign of the March of Return. A year and a half ago, March 30th, Hamas decided to use their civilians against us yet again. They rallied their civilians to go out to the border of Gaza and to protest. And granted, guys, many of these people just go out and protest. But how these protests manifest is these protesters are about 100, maybe 200 yards back from the fence, okay? But then further up, you're going to have Hamas terrorists who are actively trying to cut through our border fence, and by the way, on a couple occasions actually successfully did so and infiltrated into Israel, throw grenades across our border at soldiers, snipe at our soldiers, and shoot at our soldiers. Give me one sec. And what ends up happening, guys, is our soldiers who are on the other side, they have an order. Their rules of engagement are pretty simple. If you feel like your life is in immediate danger, you can shoot. If you have any question of whether or not your life is in immediate danger, you cannot shoot. So a soldier feels like his life is in immediate danger, right? Let's say, I'm sorry, I'm going to make you a terrorist for a second. Let's say you're the terrorist, okay? And you're shooting at me. And I have a clear shot of you, okay? And you're shooting right at me, okay? So I aim, and you're in the act of shooting at me, and I shoot at you. And you step one step to the left. And you're an innocent 14-year-old kid. And that bullet hits you instead. And now I've killed a 14-year-old kid on the Gaza border. Or what could also happen is I'm aiming for your lower extremities because we don't aim to kill, we aim to stop. We aim to neutralize. So I hit you in the leg, but that bullet goes in your leg, out the leg, ricochets off the ground, pops up and hits you in the face or in the chest, and you're dead. You're injured, but you're dead. And now a 14-year-old kid has been killed on the Gaza border. Guys, over the last year and a half, almost 250 people have been killed along the border. Many of them are terrorists. But many of them, some of them, are innocent civilians as well. And that's how it's happening. Misfires and ricochet more than anything else. And guys, unfortunately, the sad reality is that out there in the world, the message is that Israel is aiming and just shooting indiscriminately into a crowd of protesters. And that's not what's happening at all right? And you can talk to soldiers along the border of the challenges that they face between tear gas and the chaotic environment, how hard it is to actually be able to conduct any kind of defensive measures in that environment. All right? Today, by the way, I've been told by soldiers that even Hamas has minimized how much they've been shooting across the border, which is why Israel hasn't been responding, and that's why we haven't really seen casualties on the Gaza border lately. Yes?
When did you say Hamas was rallying civilians against the fence?
It started March 30th of 2009, and it continued for a while where it was almost daily, and then it teetered off, and today it's now every Friday. Every Friday there are mass protests along the border. But again, we haven't been hearing about casualties because there has been less resistance from Hamas against us, meaning less response from Israel, obviously. Because if there's nothing, then we're not just shooting indiscriminately into a crowd. That's the whole point. And people can protest. As long as they're not in the closed military zone and as long as they're not threatening Israel in any way, they have every right to protest along the border. All right? Guys, there is something I got to talk about when it comes to Gaza that has nothing to do with threats. Up until now, everything that I've said has been from the perspective of Israel. But I need to flip perspectives for a second. Gaza is also a territory that at the moment is in absolute disrepair. It's been ruled by Hamas now for 12 years. Hamas has taken about 1/5 of its budget and invested it in infrastructure. The rest has gone to terrorist activity. Much of the cement that has gone into the Gaza Strip has gone to constructing tunnels rather than constructing homes or schools. At the moment, because of people drilling into the ground looking for clean water sources, the water source in Gaza is now almost entirely poisoned. And so they do not have a clean water source. Even their own aquifer that they had, which is eroding, also unfortunately has poisoned water flowing into it. So their water source now comes from Israel, from a desalinization plant that we have in Ashkelon. They have about 3 to 5 hours of electricity a day, also provided by Israel, paid for by Fatah in the West Bank, which is why there's only 3 to 5 hours, because that's all Fatah is willing to pay for. I want you guys to think about something. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, there were 1 million people living in the Gaza Strip. Today, there are 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip 25 years later. Guys, what that means is that in Gaza today, half of the population is under the age of 25, which means they were born into this reality. When Hamas took over, they were 12 years old. Those are the oldest. They never had a say. They don't have a say. Even if they're angry at Hamas and they want to protest, we know what will happen to them because that happened a few months ago. In March of this year, people rose up to protest their living conditions, and Hamas gunned them down in the streets. These people are living in despair, and this younger generation, guys, looks ahead and says, I do not have a future. And so them going out to the border is an act of despair. Them joining Hamas is saying, there's nothing else for me to do. And by the way, it also might just be that from the moment they've been born, they have been brainwashed by Hamas to believe in that ideology. And so you have that education going on as well, with zero access to the outside world and to Jews. Maybe they have Wi-Fi. By the way, you know what they're getting, what they're using to get people to go out to the border to protest? They offer them 2 things: a hot meal and free Wi-Fi. That's what it takes to get somebody to go out to the border and put themselves in a position where they very much understand that something terrible can happen to them. Guys, these people are living in despair. There is over 70% unemployment in the Gaza Strip today. So these kids are looking at their future saying, I do not have one. And it's a choice that they make of who to blame. If you're raised with the Hamas ideology, you are going to be blaming Israel. Some people have said, no, this is very clearly Hamas's fault, and those are the people who are out in the streets protesting. Many people who have that opinion keep it quiet because they don't want to be killed by Hamas. Guys, Gaza is an incredibly sad reality. And when you talk about it, when you have conversations with people about what's going on in the Gaza Strip, the one thing I will say is that if everything that I just said didn't create some kind of empathy, I hope that somehow you can find it. Because they might hate us, and they might be raised to hate us. And they are, guys. They're raised to hate us, and they're raised to want to destroy Israel, but they're 15 years old. And they don't have food, and they don't have water, and they don't have electricity. One thing that Israel is doing is daily, guys, we send in about 1,000 trucks of aid into the Gaza Strip. Food, water, medical supplies, other things. Problem is it goes into Gaza, and whose hands does it go right into? Hamas. And Hamas takes it, and Hamas then taxes it and profit off of it before they distribute it. So we understand that our own aid is another profit source for Hamas. Yes?
Are there ways to get people living in the Gaza Strip who believe that Hamas is trying to help them to realize that, like, the situation that they're in is because of Hamas and that they're, like, in extremely toxic conditions?
Maybe, but it would probably be a massive information campaign. The problem is that there aren't enough people in the world who would say that. There are enough people in the world who would say just the opposite. And that's also what's happening, right? You're a person in Gaza, you're on Twitter, you're looking at what people are saying about Israel, and it's reaffirming everything that you believe, right? Because there's a lot more voices on Twitter or on social media saying that Israel is to blame than saying that Hamas is to blame. So the only way, and what I always say, the answer to the question of what can we do, the very little that we can do is raise awareness. to get to a point where more and more people are saying Hamas is putting them in these conditions. We have to be able to do something about Hamas. There has to be international pressure to stop this reality. But it's not happening. The international pressure is being put on Israel. And there's very little that Israel can do to try to change the reality. And I got to add one thing before I take your guys' questions. Guys, back in 2007 when Hamas took over Gaza, Israel did something. We adopted a policy of separation and isolation. We said we have to separate from Hamas and isolate Hamas. And at that moment, we implemented a blockade around Gaza. We sealed off our borders, and there was a sea blockade of a certain amount of distance that people could go out to on boats. And from there, it was stopped. And nobody was able to enter the Gaza Strip from the water or from the border without being checked. We basically stopped most things from going into the Gaza Strip. Necessary items went in, but unnecessary items didn't go in. We had a short list of things that could go in. Everything else was banned. The policy didn't work, okay? So 3 years later, we reconfigured it, and we switched the policy. And we said, here's a list of things that can't go into Gaza. Everything else can go in. The list of things that can't go in, guys, some people would say, it's kind of harsh. Toys are on the list of things that can't go in. That's what you're going to hear. Now, does that mean that a teddy bear can't go into Gaza? No, a teddy bear can go into Gaza. What kind of toy can't go into Gaza? A toy that has a motor on it. Because a toy that has a motor, that motor can be taken out and can be used for a rocket. Aggregates can't go into the Gaza Strip to a certain extent. Or there's a limitation. What are aggregates? They're used to make cement. So you want to fix your aquifer, you're going to need aggregates. But can we send in enough? And if we do send in enough, are they actually going to go to fixing the aquifer? Or is it going to go to building tunnels? So a lot of people say to us, well, it's your fault. You guys have this blockade. And if you guys lifted your blockade, Gaza would be fine. Really? Because everything goes in. It just goes in, but it has to be checked by Israel first. And guys, note that they also have a border with somebody else, don't they? They have a border with Egypt. Egypt also is upholding the blockade. And the reason for that is because Hamas also threatened Egypt. And so Egypt said, we're in armed conflict with you, just like Israel is, and we're going to uphold the same blockade. The blockade is legal under international law. But that would be their argument against you. They would say you are to blame because of the blockade. There is a mismanagement from within of the Gaza Strip, and we see it very clearly. There is no reason that sewage should be flowing up into the streets of Gaza. You know why they are? Because the sewage system that Israel put in place in the Gaza Strip when it was under Israeli control was made of lead pipes. And what can you use lead pipes for? Bullets. Rockets. And they have been digging up their own sewage system to use it for rockets. So sewage is flowing into the streets. I do not understand how my blockade is affecting that in any way, except for maybe if we didn't have a blockade, they would be getting lead pipes from Israel and then be using those for rockets instead of their sewage system. I'm not exactly sure how that would be better. Yeah.
Why do we never hear criticism towards Egypt about the blockade, yet Israel is constantly under fire?
I think you can expand your question generally. Why don't we ever hear criticism about most of the things that Arabs do to other Arabs in the Middle East?
Because we're Jewish.
Well, you say we're Jewish. I think the bigger argument is because we're Western. And I think in the world today, Western countries are held to higher standards. We hold ourselves to higher standards, right? So we would expect more criticism to a certain extent. But I also think, let's just be honest, zoom out. What's the ultimate problem that we keep talking about? People don't even know that there's a blockade, let alone know that there's a blockade being upheld by Israel and by Egypt. Do you know what I mean? So they have to have that information to be able to criticize it, and they don't. That's why, again, we're sitting here, right? The whole point is that we have to have this information so we can share it with others. Okay? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I also think that it's inconvenient for people to criticize Egypt or Jordan for their mistreatment of the Palestinians because it hurts their narrative when they say that Israel is not the only one to blame.
Right.
Because then it takes away the blame. And,
Right.
but also, I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think of the economic portion of Trump's bill, essentially, that kind of invest in businesses and people?
I think from the standpoint of if you look at past peace agreements, None of them included, from what I've seen, an economic component. And I think that's a smart way to go, that I think in the future any peace plan has to include an economic component, because ultimately we are talking about building a country. And a country needs to be able to function on its own and have its own economy. And that hasn't really been the conversation. It's more been about like, let's create the country and we'll figure it out once it's done. Like once Israel withdraws, we'll figure out how, Palestine is gonna work. Instead, they're basically saying, but let's try to create it beforehand. Like, let's try to figure out a way that we know that there will be investment in this area so that they can actually function on their own. So the specifics of the plan, I'm not an economist, I have no idea, but just the notion of having an economic part of the plan and trying to get people to invest is I think, a smart way to go about it. That being said, we have to note that I think what this showed more than anything else, the fact that the Palestinian Authority boycotted what happened in Bahrain and said, we're not going to take part in it, says a lot about where the Palestinian Authority stands ideologically in terms of nation building. And more importantly, I think that also you can pull back and say that what it really is a judgment on is also how they feel about the Trump administration, where they've really just discarded the Trump administration, believing that they are just biased and they're on Israel's side and they're not going to be able to be an unbiased mediator for peace in this conflict. Yeah.
If Israel knows, and everyone knows that Hamas is a terrorist organization and that they don't have good intentions with the resources we give them, why can't Israel figure out a way to get the resources straight to the people who actually need them instead of just wasting our money and funding, whatever?
So I wouldn't call it a waste of money, right? The question is about the aid that we give to Gaza. Can we figure out a better way? I'm assuming, based on what I know about the government and the military of Israel, that if there was a better way, we would be doing it, right? Hamas controls the Gaza Strip through and through. The idea that we would be able to get aid directly to the people, if we could, we would. Do you know what I mean? So there's got to be a reason that we can't. Do I think that it's a waste? No, because we're not just going to let people starve, And by the way, there's two ways to look at it. From a moral standpoint, I think a lot of Israelis would say definitely we should keep doing it because we're humans and these people are suffering. But on the other hand, even if you remove all of the emotion and the morality for a second, from a strategic standpoint, the worse off they are, the more blowback we're going to experience. The worse off they are, the more threatening they're going to become towards Israel. So we're trying to do at the moment, so we're not trying to fix the situation in Gaza because we as Israel don't believe that we can. But what we're trying to do is keep it as stable as it can possibly be.
Why isn't there a way? Like, I forget who it was, but somebody was saying on one of our tours like a couple weeks ago, they were saying like all the grenades that were like thrown in the war say like made in USA. Why can't water and food packaging, whatever, that's sent in to like from Israel, like why can't these people know that it's from Israel?
They won't take Israeli products, from what I understand. Like, we've offered them to fix the sewage system. Israel created a hard plastic piping system that's not lead or metal that they wouldn't then be able to use for rockets, and we've offered it to them, and they've refused because they say we will not use Israeli-made products.
But they accept our water.
It's water. They don't accept it, they're not drinking. It's a survival thing, you know what I mean? They don't need our hard plastic pipes to survive, but they need that water to survive, So, again, it's a real catch-22. That's what it comes down to with Gaza. Yeah.
Do you know, the toll, sustaining, these constant threats on the borders takes on, Israel's economy?
The toll that it takes on our economy. Well, our economy is thriving. Let's put it that way. That being said, whenever there's a war breaks out in Israel, it hardcore hits our economy. And then the other thing to think about is those of us who live in Israel, a huge chunk, we pay a huge, huge tax for our defense. So I don't know how much that affects the economy, but much of our money is going towards our defense, right? Yeah.
What do you say about the population decrease since 2007?
Increase.
Increase in Gaza.
In Gaza, they've doubled their population in the last 25 years. From the mid-1990s until today, their population has grown from 1 million to 2 million, meaning that half the population is under the age of 25.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people who are suffering in Gaza Strip,
Bless you.
how are they getting out? And is there a way for them
They can't get out.
Why not?
We've closed our borders. Egypt has closed their border. They can't go through the sea. But more importantly, even if they could get out, they have nowhere to go. They are citizenshipless people. These are people who do not have citizenship in any country. They do not have a passport. They have what they call travel documents. And as a result of that, it is very, very challenging to almost impossible to get a visa or a permit to go to another country. And I gotta add, some of them don't want to leave. It's their home. Somebody asked me this recently, like, why aren't they getting on rafts and like floating off to Europe the way that people have been leaving, North Africa and Libya and been floating off and trying to get to to Italy or to other European countries. And I realize it's just not, they actually, to a certain extent, they do want to be here. They very much believe that this is their home. They just want the conditions to be improved. But they really don't have an exit point. And Israel has closed our borders for purely security reasons. But they don't have an airport. They don't have a seaport. So they can't exit through Israel. They can't exit through Egypt. Every so often, Egypt opens the border, but it's rare. So they don't have an exit point. Guys, a lot of people accuse us and say, Gaza's an open-air prison. It's a terrible accusation. And it paints unfortunately, out of context, it paints a really, really bad image. But I will say that if you look at the people who live in Gaza, for them, it does feel like they live in an open-air prison based on their reality. Okay? They live under a dictatorial, tyrannical regime that is Hamas. They can't speak out. They can't protest. They don't have jobs. They can barely feed themselves. Feels like prison. Okay? I want to move on from Gaza because we have a lot to cover, all right? So very quickly, let's just talk about the West Bank. We've talked about it a little bit, about the topography. Very important for us to separate. Hamas is in control in the Gaza Strip. Fatah, their rival, is in control partially in the West Bank, and we'll talk about how that happened, all right? At the moment, we'll leave it there because as we go through the history, when we get up to modern times, we'll talk about the West Bank more and kind of how the West Bank was divided and what it looks like more today. So now we got to go back in time. We laid out today, but I'm a historian, and as far as I'm concerned, guys, you cannot understand this conflict unless you know the history leading up to where we are today. So we're going to go through this relatively quickly. The real question, though, is where do we start the story? And guys, there's a lot of dispute about this. A lot of people would argue you do not go back more than 150 years to talk about this modern-day conflict. It is unnecessary. That is when the conflict began, and going back any further is just going to complicate things. It doesn't complicate anything. In fact, going back further, guys, is absolutely necessary. Because the only way to understand this conflict is to understand, first and foremost, Jewish connection to this land, and why, when the Jews said 100 plus years ago, we need a state, this was the territory that they set their sights on. And also at the same time, knowing that there's both Jews and Arabs involved in this conflict, we also have to understand the start of the Arab story in this territory. And that also began further back than 150 years ago. So we got to go back pretty far. How far back do we need to go to start to understand Jewish connection to this land? I would say we got to go back to the beginning. Now, not the beginning of time, because I can't prove that. What I have to go back to is the beginning of recordable history of our presence in this land. So I'm going back about 3,000 years, okay? 3,000 years ago, guys, is when the Jews became a people in this land. Now, I got to stress this. As a result of that, we are indigenous to this territory, guys. That means our health, our traditions, our language, our culture all stem from this territory. Guys, I'm going to stress this more and more. That means everywhere in the world, other than here, Jews are foreign. We are alien. This is the only place that when we are here, we are home and we belong. And that all started 3,000 years ago. That's when that connection started. We had the Israelite kingdom. Think of King David, King Solomon, the construction of the first temple. And then what happens? Let's go through this real fast. The Babylonians come in, destroy the first temple, and exile the Jews. We are sent to the area of what is today modern-day Iraq. Guys, what happens in Babylon at that time is an ideology is born. This ideology is simply the Jews yearning to return to their homeland. It's when things like the Psalms of if I forget Jerusalem, I forget my right hand come up. That we wept on the banks of the rivers of Babylon, yearning to return to our home. And guys, at that time we were lucky, and 70 years later we did. What's that ideology eventually going to be called a few thousand years later? Zionism. So we returned under the Persian Empire. We built the second temple. We lived under the Persians, then under the Greeks. The Greeks tried to Hellenize us and assimilate us, and eventually we were like, yeah, no, we're good. We forced them out, right? That was the story of Hanukkah, right? What's up? And we got a state as a result of this. For the second time, we have another Judean kingdom rising up. Think of the Hashmonaim. This is the time period. 166 years it's going to last. And then who comes in? The Roman Empire. Roman Empire come in, colonize this area, take over, and they're going to do three important things.
You said like the Judean kingdom was created after who?
After the Greeks, when we pushed out the Greeks. Judah the Maccabee, right? We push them out. We create the Judean kingdom under the Hashmonaim. The Romans do three important things. One, in 70 of the Common Era, they are going to destroy the Second Temple. Two, about 75 years later, there's going to be another Jewish revolt. This will prompt them to eventually try to complete full Jewish exile from this land, meaning they expelled almost the entire Jewish population. And three, they changed the name of this territory. The territory at the time was called Judea. That's where we get our name, guys. We are the Jews from Judea. And they really wanted to erase the fact that we were ever here. How did they do it? They had to change the name. So who'd they name it after? Our ancient enemy from the Bible, who didn't exist at this point anymore and were foreign themselves to this territory, the Philistines. And this territory will become known as Philistina, a word that over the next 2,000 years will be adapted into the word Palestine. And that's how we get that term for this territory. Side note, very oftentimes today, guys, we are accused of being colonizers. Everything that I just said is your evidence to refute this notion. We are not colonizers of this land. We are indigenous to it. This is home. There's no other home base to colonize from. But when somebody looks at you as an American and says to you, you're a white colonizing Jew from Europe, this is your moment where you look at them and say, with all due respect, if you are an anti-colonialist, I'm not sure why you are against me. Because the only reason for my white skin and the fact that you're calling me European is because 2,000 years ago I was colonized. And I was dragged out of my home by the Romans. And some of our ancestors were taken to Europe. And 2,000 years later I look like this. But it was because I was colonized, not the other way around. And me returning to my homeland wasn't colonization, but it was just that. It was a liberation of an indigenous people returning home. That's what happened in modern times. But it all stems back to this time period. Yes?
What's your response to someone that says okay, that was then, but now there's a Palestinian identity?
So I want you to hold questions like that because that's what we'll tackle them at the end, okay? Because that's going to veer us right off course, and then we can just keep doing that for the rest of this, okay? But keep it. It's a very important question, okay? So guys, we're now in exile. Super important. Throughout this entire time period, guys, there will always be Jews here, okay? Even though we went through exile, some Jews always remained, and we have had continuous Jewish presence in this land for 3,000 years until today. Now, what happened? The Romans take over. Eventually, the Byzantines take over, which is basically just the Eastern Roman Empire after they adopted Christianity. So the Christians come in. They're going to be here until the 7th century. 7th century, we have another important piece of the puzzle. Who's now is introduced into this territory? We are now going to have the rise of the Muslim population here, as we are going to see Islamic conquest in the 7th century spreading throughout the Arab world and North Africa. They make their way into this territory and they colonize it from the Christians. Guys, pretty much up until today, there will be Islamic rule in this territory. It starts out as Arab Islamic rule. There will be a quick period where the Crusaders pop in and take back control, and then in come the Muslims again. And by 1517, you're going to have Muslims, but not Arabs. You're going to have the Turkish Muslim Empire called the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is going to rule here from 1517 until 1917. 400 years. Now, guys, under the Ottomans, a lot's going to change. Most of the time under the Ottomans, this area was barren. It was mostly empty. There weren't very many people living here. And as you guys can see, the territory that was dubbed on the map Palestine at this time is actually going to be divided up into 3 different territories. You guys see that? The black dotted lines. So we see that we have the northern part is part of the province of Beirut. The middle part is part of the Musa Arifa of Jerusalem. And that southern part is part of the Viryet, the province of Syria. Okay? Now again, guys, there aren't very many people living here. If we go into the 1800s, you've got about 400,000 people living here, 370,000 others and 30,000 Jews. And by those others, the majority were Arabs, but you also had Greeks and Turks and Persians and some others mixed in. Then comes 1881. And in 1881, the Jews in Russia suffer a pogrom. It was a massacre where Russian police even participated. And a little bit earlier than that, there was a revival of Zionism, of this notion of, let's go home. And some of them said, now's the time. And by 1882, we are going to have the first big wave of Jewish immigration, what we call the first Aliyah to Israel, to Palestine. They will immigrate in. They will buy land from Arab landowners. They will come in legally under the Ottomans, and they will begin to settle this land. It will begin, guys, along that coastal plain, cities like Petah Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov. And then we'll also expand into the north, near the Kinneret, near the Sea of Galilee, in the Chula Valley. Guys, these people were the pioneers. They drained the swamplands, and they tilled the fields, and they made this land start to flourish again. They struggled, by the way. Now, this also is where we are going to start to see the early tensions of the modern-day conflict, because some Arabs will be living on the land that the Jews purchase. And then the Jews show up and say, this is now my land, and you have to leave. And what does that feel like from the Arab side? Like their land is being stolen from them. And that's the start. This is the start, those moments, this hints of the larger Palestinian narrative of you stole our land from us. We didn't. We came in legally. We bought it legally. But there's facts, and then there's perception of facts. And guys, the way that they perceived it is our land is being stolen from us. Super important to note, guys, there were some Arabs who were very anti. There were some Arabs who were very pro. There were some Arabs who the Jews had great relations with. All right? And it depended on the tribe that you came from. Some tribes very pro, some tribes not so much. Okay? There's going to be another reason for more Jewish immigration. Zionism is going to get a boost when a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, or hipster Herzl here, jumps in and spreads this message of political Zionism. We must create a Jewish state. He writes it in a book, in a pamphlet in 1896, The Jewish State, Der Judenstaat. He convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897, pushing forward this idea of Jewish nationalism, a state for Jews, to free us from the anti-Semitism and the persecution that we're suffering across Europe. People start getting the Zionist bug, and more people start to immigrate. Now we're going to have another big wave of immigration, Second Aliyah in 1904. What prompts it? Another pogrom in Kishinev in 1903. Again, with Herzl's push, people are fleeing these territories, but today, at this point, they're now going to Palestine rather than going to the United States or to other parts of Europe. We start to see people growing this territory. Guys, this immigration, 1909, we're going to see from these guys, the Second Aliyah, the formation of Tel Aviv, for example, north of Jaffa. Okay? They're going to start to build more and more communities. Then comes World War I. And the Ottoman Empire during World War I pairs up with the losing side, the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans. And in 1917, the British will successfully make their way from the south up into Jerusalem and take it over from the Ottomans. By the end of the war, they will have taken over the entire territory that we now call Israel. Now, the British made a lot of deals during the war. They first wanted to recruit Arab fighters to fight against the Ottomans, so they went down to the Hijaz. And they went to the leader of the Hijaz at the time, a guy by the name of Sheikh Hussein, and said, yo, Sheikh Hussein of the Hashemite Arab tribe, help us fight against the Ottomans. They went back and forth in a correspondence called the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, where Hussein was demanding control over territory by the end of the war. And they promised him land from Damascus down into the Arabian Peninsula over to Baghdad. He thinks that it includes Palestine. The British say that it doesn't. There's going to be a dispute. A year later, after a lot of lobbying by Jews in Europe, 1917, the Jews get a promise from the British during the war, the Balfour Declaration. We support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The war ends. Agreements are signed. Comes 1920 and the League of Nations is born. And they got to figure out, what are we going to do with this territory of the Ottoman Empire? And the decision was made. Give it to the British and the French, who at the moment are controlling it because they took over control during the war, and give them temporary control. Create mandates. You have temporary control. Your job is to allow the native populations, the people living there, to create their own countries. So they map out mandates. And the British Mandate of Palestine is created. Notice that it starts as a much bigger territory. And what they said in the League of Nations in the British Mandate was that this territory was going to be a Jewish state. A national home for the Jewish people. What that means is going to be debated for the next 3 decades. But this is designated a national home. What they did was, they took the Balfour Declaration, they adopted it right into the British Mandate. So the Balfour Declaration now becomes recognized international law, because this is an international treaty. Hussein McMahon didn't make its way in. So what happened? Well, they left a note in the mandate that they might potentially chop off part of this territory. And that's exactly what they do. To fulfill their promise to the Hashemites, the British, before ratification in Parliament, chop off the entire territory to the east of the river, what becomes the country of the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan. And also, notice, they chopped off the Golan Heights and gave it over to the French Mandate of Syria. That was just due to negotiations that were being made between the French and the British. Guys, the British thought they would be good. Look, it's a 2-state solution. An Arab state alongside a Jewish state. What could go wrong? Guys, Arabs are not homogenous. They are not just one group of people. They are, at this point, very tribal. And so you pleased one tribe, the Hashemites. But what about the other tribes? What about the Arabs who live between the river and the sea? In what remains of the British Mandate of Palestine? Some of them don't want to live in a Jewish state. And some are fine. But those who don't want to will be spurred on by the man who takes over to be the leader of the Islamic community here, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. And they will be incited by him to go out and commit violence. So starting in 1920, we're going to have a bout of violence, massacres in that year. And then again in 1921. And then again in 1929. Guys, this prompts Jewish militias to form. The first one being the Haganah, a defensive Jewish militia to defend Jews from these massacres. By 1929, after a major massacre that the Haganah failed to defend against, you have the creation of another militia, the Irgun. And these two are going to be the two until 1940. More violence will ensue in the 1930s. All of this prompting the British to say, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we got to reconsider the mandate. And comes 1937, and it's in the middle of an Arab revolt that is killing both Jews and Brits, and the Jews are now responding and killing Arabs. The British say, let's try something else, and they propose the Peel Commission. Basically what this says is, we are going to give 20% of the territory to the Jews. The northern part and part of the coastal plain where they live. The remaining 80% will be given to the Arabs. The Jews said, okay. I mean, it's not what we want, but it's 1937 and this is what we need, so we'll take it. The Arab leadership, guys, at this point will unite under one ideology, what now you can dub Arab rejectionism, the idea that no Jewish state should exist in any borders. And they said so emphatically. They said they could live here. They could be autonomous underneath us, but they should not have a state of their own. They are a minority. And we were a minority. It's true. Why did we say no to autonomy? Because autonomy doesn't give us protection. And the whole reason that we were pushing for a Jewish state at this point was to have an army so that we could be protected. Yes?
How much percent did you say this was being given?
20 to the Jews, 80 to the Arabs. 80. Guys, the Peel Commission never went through. More years of revolt until 1939. To end the revolt, the British pass the famous British White Papers that are going to limit Jewish immigration in May of 1939. This limits Jewish immigration that over the next 5 years, only 75,000 Jews will be able to immigrate into Palestine. This was a massive reduction in immigration, and many would argue a massive violation of the mandate itself. It was May of 1939. Within 3 months, Germany will invade Poland on September 1st, and World War II will begin officially. Guys, Jews were already in concentration camps at the time. And we all know what happens. The borders in Europe get sealed. Jews can't even make it out, even if they could make it to Palestine. But even if they could, our immigration was limited. We all know what happens in Europe. What happens here? Well, in the beginning it was, we got to fight against the British because of the white papers, but we also have to fight against the Nazis. So we kind of need to align ourselves with the British to fight against the Nazis, but still fight against British policy. And that's what we did throughout the war. And by the way, another Jewish militia will be born at this time, called Lehi, in 1940. And the reason for it was because of the truce that was made with the British to fight against the Nazis together. 5 years of war. And guys, during that war, Lehi, the Irgun, they're going after the British. The Arabs are still killing Jews. Jews are killing Arabs. There's a lot of chaos. Come 1945 and the war ends. The UN is established. There's still chaos here. Jews are now in refugee camps, in displaced persons camps, trying to get into Palestine, but there's still a limit on our immigration. So the Jews are even more pissed, and they're going after the British even more. So the British turn to the UN and say, you guys solve the problem because we can't figure it out. And the UN in 1947 will send a special committee to Palestine who will examine the area. And they will come out with the UN Partition Plan of 1947. Guys, the UN Partition Plan gave 55% to the Jews and 45% of the land to the Arabs. The Jews got the land where Jews lived predominantly, and vice versa with the Arabs as well. The one thing that the Jews will not get is Jerusalem, which was a very big deal for us. But regardless, we still accepted this plan. You could argue it was out of sheer desperation. We just lost 6 million people. We had refugees. We needed a place to go. The need for a Jewish state became most apparent after the Holocaust and during the Holocaust. The Arabs stuck to their guns. No Jewish state. And across the board, there was Arab rejectionism of the UN partition plan. Yes?
Was Jerusalem the only international zone, or was there another one?
No. Just Jerusalem. Yeah. Yeah.
What were the demographics at the time, Jewish and Arab?
There were 1.2 million Arabs, and there were 600,000 Jews. So there was 66% Arab, 33% Jewish. A third were Jewish, two-thirds were Arab. Guys, the Arabs said, we're not doing it. And they said, we're going to go to war if we have to. So instead of choosing more compromise, instead of saying, we don't like this plan, can we suggest another one? On November 29, 1947, this plan was passed by the United Nations. Guys, this is not law. This didn't change anything on the ground. This was an advisory statement because that's all the UN General Assembly can actually do. But they said, if this happens, we'll support it. We're dancing in the streets, guys, celebrating this plan. As people return home from those celebrations on the early hours of November 30th, Hajj Amin al-Husseini's Arab gangs here in this territory will start to attack Jews on the roads. And that will be the start of our War of Independence, November 30th, 1947. The first phase of that war will go from November 30th until May 15th, 1948. Now, in those 6 months, guys, the Jewish militias were incredibly prepared. The Arabs were not coordinated and not prepared. And during those 6 months, guys, the Jews will not lose 1 inch of territory until May 13th. That will be the first time that we lose territory. We will gain territory and we will win every battle. What does this lead to? Massive Arab fleeing. Because as we win battles, we expel people, guys. If you are in a hostile area and we took over that hostile area and you're there, you are going to be expelled and sent into places like the West Bank or into Gaza, or if you're in the north, into Lebanon or Syria. But then the Arab leadership does something in addition to that. Guys, during the War of Independence, there were some atrocities committed by Jewish militia members. They are documented. They were the exception. They were not the rule. But the Arab leadership at the time made them seem like they were the rule. They were spreading rumors saying that the Jews were going village to village massacring people. And so Arabs feared every time when they heard Jews were coming, they ran. And it backfired on them. And they even admitted that it backfired on them. And then you had other issues where when the Jews successfully took over a territory, like Haifa, for example, which was meant to be in our area anyway, they said to their Arab neighbors, you do not have to leave. You can live here. We have lived together in this city. And Arab leadership came in, and the Arabs said to them, you better leave. If you stay here and you become a citizen of this Jewish state that could potentially be created, you will be a traitor for the rest of your life. So you better leave. And people from their own leadership were guilted into leaving this territory and ended up as refugees. So we have fleeing, we have expulsions, and we have Arab leadership telling their own people to leave, saying, we'll defeat the Jews, and you guys can come on back. That's not what happened. Comes May 14th, 1948. And on May 15th, we are aware of the fact that the British mandate's going to end and the British are going to leave. So on May 14th, Israel, the Jews heed the opportunity and we declare independence. David Ben-Gurion stands up and declares a few things in our declaration. One, that we are going to be a Jewish state, but we will also be a democratic state. Equal rights for all of our citizens, but this country will be Jewish in character and Jewish in majority. And second, that we want peace with our neighbors. We are not interested in going to war. He knew exactly what was coming. Guys, how did we actually become a country? We got recognition. On that same day, we will get recognition immediately from 3 countries. The first one will be the United States. Within 51 minutes, the third country will come in, and that will be the Soviet Union with Joseph Stalin recognizing Israel. And sneaking in at number 2, Guatemala. I don't know why, but that's my favorite fun fact about the founding of the State of Israel. Guatemala sweeps in, and guys, we get recognition from 3 countries within an hour, and Israel is born. May 15th, 1948, the British mandate ends, and the British leave in the dead of night. And that same day, not only is Israel born, but the IDF is born as well, the Israel Defense Forces, as our militias will almost entirely disband and come together. And the reason for that was simple. Out of sheer necessity, the IDF was created. Because that same day, we will also be invaded by 5 countries: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, with assistance from Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Guys, the entire Arab world basically descended upon us. And now we're into the second phase of our War of Independence that will go from May 15th until the early months of 1949, when we will sign armistice agreements to end this war between us and our neighbors. Ceasefire agreements. There are 2 aftermaths from this war. The first one are refugees. First, let's talk about the forgotten refugees. Guys, at the end of this war, and because of the establishment of the State of Israel, 850,000 Jews will either be expelled or will flee from the Arab world due to persecution, and they will make their way to Israel. They will be absorbed into this country. Not well, by the way. I gotta stress. We absorbed them, we gave them citizenship. But guys, these people did experience racism from the white Ashkenazi Jews from Europe. And it's not a part of our history that we should ignore, because for them it's a very important part of their history. But they were absorbed, they were made citizens, and I think proudly say 70 years later, we've walked back from much of that racism that they experienced. Today, most marriages in Israel are actually mixed marriages between Ashkenazi Jews from Europe and Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews from the Middle East or North Africa. Guys, as a result of this, Israel created a law. It's called the Law of Return. It says that any Jew at any time can immigrate to Israel and become an automatic citizen. And what you need for this law to apply to you is 1 Jewish grandparent. Why? They called it the Hitler Law. They said if you were Jewish enough to be killed by Hitler, you're Jewish enough to be saved by the Jewish state. And guys, that became our immigration law here in Israel. You want to move to this country, you got to have 1 Jewish grandparent. If you don't, the chances of you being able to move to this country and become a citizen are slim to none. We're a nation state. That means that we have to maintain a Jewish majority. The only way to do that is to strictly prohibit people from being able to immigrate into our country. We're not the United States. We're not the UK. We're not a country that was there to absorb different populations from different places. This country was created to be a country for Jews, to protect and preserve the Jewish people, and to be a safe haven for Jews around the world. That was the reason for this law. Guys, on the other hand, we had other refugees, what I'm going to call the perpetual refugee. Arabs who flee or are expelled or are told to leave this territory and make their way into the surrounding areas. The numbers are disputed. The UN number that would be given would be 710,000 refugees at this time. They make their way into the surrounding countries, but unlike the Jewish refugees, guys, they will not be absorbed. They will be kept in refugee camps, and they will be told by the world, you have the right to return to Israel. Now, first of all, they do not have the right to return to Israel. They were never citizens of this country, and therefore they do not have a legal right to return. Now, on a moral level, should they have been allowed to return? Maybe. The argument that was made by Israel at the time was, we just fought a war with these people. We have no idea who is innocent and who is hostile. And guys, think of the context. We were not paranoid. We were genuinely afraid. It was 1949. Within the last decade, we lost 6 million Jews. And 3 years later, we tried to create a country that then at its infancy, they tried to destroy. And now you want us to reabsorb a population that could potentially become a fifth column from within the country and destroy it from within? We can't do it. So we said, like we are absorbing the many Jewish refugees from around the Arab world, these Arab countries can absorb these refugees. They didn't. They put them in refugee camps. And a UN body was created to look after them called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Arab refugees from Palestine. And 7 years later, guys, they still live in those refugee camps. Because UNRWA also gave them a special status that said that they get to pass their status on to their children. So we have now had 3 generations at least of refugees born into refugeehood in refugee camps in places like Lebanon or Syria or Jordan. And guys, right here, there is a refugee camp here in Jerusalem. There is a refugee camp 3 in Bethlehem. We will see them today on tour. It's hard to talk about the refugees. From a legal place, everything that I just said was very sterile and very unemotional. But from an emotional place, guys, these people have been raised as victims. They've been told they have the right to return. They've been told that they need to continue to fight for that right to return. Even though Israel has emphatically said from the beginning, we cannot let this population return into our country. And they have been kept in that mentality of refugeehood and victimhood for 70 plus years. And many of them, again, are still living in refugee camp conditions, which 7 years later, as far as I'm concerned, is an injustice. You should have empathy for these people. They don't know another reality. Yeah.
Isn't like their status as refugees very different because they're considered refugees until they either return or are financially compensated?
Yeah, other refugees, if they're resettled in another country and get citizenship, they're not considered refugees anymore under the other UN body, which is the UN High Commission on Refugees, the UNHCR. With Palestinian refugees, even if you go to another country and you settle and you become a citizen, you're still considered a refugee. But you might not get benefits, but you're still technically considered a refugee. And that's, just like you said, the issue will be that they will be considered refugees until they return.
Or until they receive financial compensation from Israel, right?
They haven't really been asking for financial compensation from Israel, but it would definitely be something that, yes. If they did, then they would no longer be able to claim any kind of right. Yeah.
Because they're allowed to pass their refugee status to their children, so is it like I was displaced in the 50s.
In 1948.
In 1948, and I have a kid. Can my kid then continue that refugee status?
Oh, yeah.
Children?
It's now been passed on 3-4 generations already.
So how does that work? I'm just confused because why I get why it's like different because they don't technically have like that like state, but like I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is like how because in like 100 years there could still be Palestinian refugees when like how does that work? Like just
They sit there and they continue to demand a right of return, and no one at the moment has any interest in changing the status because any issues in this conflict that are considered final status issues that need to be worked out in negotiations, usually at this point people just won't mess with the status quo. And the status quo is that they pass their refugee status on to their children. and they will continue to do so. So you are right. It is a growing problem that won't have an end unless they are allowed to return or a state is created that they can return to. And maybe even not then. There's an ideological problem here, for sure. Okay?
So then, when I guess like engaging in like a dialogue or conversation with someone who throws out numbers about like refugees, like how the thing that I guess I like struggle with is how do you I guess grasp like a number that isn't like if we were to talk about like refugee like a different country, you'd say like, oh, these are the amount of refugees, and once they're settled, they're not refugees anymore.
Right.
They're refugees, but like there could be an endless amount of refugees based on like the amount of kids they have.
So you give them the number of what back then there were 710,000 registered according to the UN. Today there are 5.4 million. That's all you can only predict using birth rates based on what we've seen how much more they could grow.
So if someone throws out the number like, oh, what about like the 5.4 million like
Refugees.
how
So we'll talk about it because as time goes on, we've come up with solutions to this problem. They just haven't been accepted. Okay, so we'll talk about modern times what we've done to try to figure out how to answer this question. Okay, real quick, do you guys want to get up and stretch for a second? Yeah? Yeah, okay, good, do it. Just don't like we have a lot to get through. Whew. There's still so much to get through. It's one of those conflicts. I'm glad we're filming it. You guys can get the video and just watch it over and over and over again.
Probably will.
Put it on YouTube.
That's the idea. There's going to be a lot of uses for this video once it's done. We've been waiting to film me doing the last time you filmed me doing this lecture was 7 years ago? November 2012?
Wait.
Yep.
I have a Jewish
At the In Focus. God, I would cringe watching that video today. I'm so biased. I'm so biased in that video, guys. I'm like right wing, just like spitting out like, oh God, it makes me sad now. it's, you develop as an educator and you develop as, you learn more information and you become way, way, way more balanced. And you know what I mean? Like once you expose yourself to more. And at that point, I had not been exposed. But when you're here, you can get exposed a lot more. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe getting a camera angle from this side would also be a good idea.
Yeah, we're doing what we can right now. It's okay. We'll figure it out. We're always going to do some editing. It'll be great. All right? Yeah.
Can we make it onto the StandWithUs Instagram?
At some point today, maybe.
Yeah.
I'll
It's an
tell 'em.
Instagram takeover.
See what happens. We should do an Instagram takeover when we go on tour.
Yeah, we should all go live.
Yeah, that was so fun.
I'll ask one before we leave. Okay, here we go. I love it. I love the way you're thinking. If you guys like tag Stand With Us though, like you can get put on our story throughout the day. Okay, like when we're on tour, do it. Like especially when we're out in the field. All right, let's keep going. So the other aftermath from the War of Independence is going to be the borders. Okay, which I really shouldn't call borders, but I'll call the lines that are now drawn on the map. Okay. So first and foremost, we're going to get the Gaza Strip, the line around Gaza delineated. It's usually, very informally, oftentimes people call it the blue line, but it's a 1949 armistice line drawn around the Gaza Strip. The line around the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, will become known as the green line. The reason for that is really simple. The Israeli negotiator who was in the room brought one thing with him, and that was a green marker. And that's what was used to draw the line on the map once it was agreed upon. It becomes known as the Green Line. The formal name for this line is the 1949 Armistice Line. The terminology that is falsely used for this line is the 1967 borders. Never use that term. And I stress that for two reasons. One, this line has nothing to do with 1967. It was drawn in 1949. And two, it was never and still to this day is not a border. In fact, the people who insisted that it wouldn't become a border were the Jordanians, not the Israelis. And the reason for that was because if it did become a border, what would Jordan have to acknowledge? Israel's existence. And they refused to do so at the end of this war. Now, they also will name that territory the West Bank because it's the only part of Jordan that sits now on the west side, on the west bank of the Jordan River. So up until this point, it was called Judea and Samaria, a name that in Israel, most Israelis still refer to that territory as Judea and Samaria. Most in the Western world will call it the West Bank because that is the more common name that today is used. Guys, this is the map of Israel, what you see here in yellow. And guys, when I say this is the map of Israel, I mean until today, this is the map of Israel according to the world. This is what, whenever somebody refers to a territory as Israel proper, this is what they're talking about. It is territory that since the end of our War of Independence, it was recognized by the world as sovereign Israeli territory. Super important also to note that at this time, 1949, guys, Jerusalem will be divided. The northern, southern, and eastern part of this city will fall into Jordanian hands, and that includes the old city of Jerusalem. The western part of the city, the western corridor, is under Israeli sovereignty, and the city will sit divided for 18 years until 1967. Guys, during these 18 years, Israel is trying to build itself up, build up its military, and settle all of the refugees properly, its own Jewish refugees. It's also trying to find allies, and FYI, it fails to do so. There will be many arms embargoes against us. We will struggle to build up our military, and no, the Americans will not become an ally of Israel until the 1970s. That being said, the Arab countries around us will align themselves with the Soviet Union, and their armies will be now armed by the Soviet Union. Comes 1967. And Arab rejectionism, guys, is still very much alive and well. And they do not want to see Israel on this map. And three countries have come together: the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Syrians. And they basically decided if one of us goes to war with Israel, we're all going to war with Israel. They turned to the leader at the time, who was seen as a leader throughout the Arab world, really a proponent of this Arab nationalism concept that's called Pan-Arabism. This leader was a guy by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt at the time, and they turned to him and said, let's go to war. Nasser very subtly declares war on Israel. He does so by closing this little waterway, it's called the Straits of Tiran, to Israeli shipping. He blockades it, not allowing Israeli ships to access our southern port in Eilat. This was an act of war. It is what started the war in 1967. Now, Israel had a decision to make once this happened. You have casus belli. You have the right to fight back to open those straits. But Israel decided to go the diplomatic route for 3 weeks. Let's try to open the straits without violence. But while that was happening, Nasser expelled UN peacekeeping forces that were in the Sinai and started to flood the area with troops. And Israel's watching all this happen, saying, look, diplomacy is great, but he's preparing a war. And we need to prepare also. And we waited and we contemplated, and on June 5th, 1967, the decision was made. You have to preemptively strike the Egyptians. And on June 5th at 8 o'clock in the morning, our Air Force will be sent into the Sinai Peninsula, and we will wipe out the Egyptian Air Force in 4 hours. How did we do it? We bombed the runways, not the planes. Don't have a runway to take off, doesn't matter how many planes you got, they're not getting into the sky. And then we did a second lap, and we destroyed the planes on the ground. Guys, the Jordanians immediately were put under Egyptian command, and they were ordered to start firing here in Jerusalem. So they start firing at us in Jerusalem, we fight back defensively. The Syrians start firing down from the Golan, we fight back defensively. They all expected Egyptian air support. They didn't get it. We then proceeded to eliminate the Syrian Air Force. And that was it, guys. It won us the war. 7 days later, this war will end on June 11, 1967. It will then be dubbed the Six-Day War. This war changed everything, guys. From a psychological standpoint, for us here in Israel, we gained some arrogance. And the arrogant Israeli that I know and love was born on June 11, 1967. Our heads grew. We went from feeling, guys, feeling vulnerable like we had not felt since World War II. And within a few weeks, we went, and we all of a sudden were feeling invincible. It was a psychological mind blow for us. On the other side, the world looked at us the same way. They looked and they said, what? The little David that is Israel, surrounded by the Goliath of the Arab world, just defeated the Goliath. And they also became the Goliath. And guys, from 1967 onwards, Israel will no longer be seen as an underdog in this conflict. We will slowly but surely take on the title of the Goliath, of the powerful one, of the force to be reckoned with. And then lastly, as we know, Israel gained a massive amount of territory during this war. All of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. It's territory that was, guys, 3 times the size of what Israel was 6 days earlier. And then we had to figure out what to do with it. There was a lot of debate, and the overarching agreement was, let's offer land back to the Arabs for peace in return. So we turned to the Arabs, and that's what we said. The Arab League met to figure out what to do in September of 1967. And they said to Israel, no. We're not making peace with you. We're not recognizing you. We're not negotiating with you. Move on. Arab rejectionism yet again. Israel had a decision to make. You don't have a partner for peace. What are you going to do with this territory now that you gained in war, that under international law you are not allowed to acquire in war? The UN at this point passes a resolution, UN Resolution 242. 242 says that Israel needs to withdraw from this territory. It also says that the Arab countries have to give Israel peace and recognition. We are still waiting for that. Yeah.
I thought that if a country declares war, then they lose UN protection over their land.
To a certain extent, yes, but there's still at the end of the war could be negotiations. It isn't de facto that if you win territory in a defensive war that it becomes yours. And that's kind of what the UN was saying. They said, like, Israel needs to withdraw, but you got to get peace from the other side. We're not just going to expect you to withdraw and, like, go into another war and give up this territory that you just gained in a war to go into another war a few years later. Which is why there's a legal argument to be made until today that Israel's military presence in places like the West Bank is still very much legal because we have yet to receive peace from the other side. So there's a dispute about gaining territory in a defensive war. It's not clear-cut. Yeah?
I thought that you were allowed to keep territory if it was to keep peace or to defend yourself.
To defend yourself.
And in this case, the West Bank, since it is technically on the border with Jordan, would provide safety.
Yes, accurate, all accurate. If there's a need for safety reasons, then maybe you could annex that territory, but the world would have to agree with you. Because the only way for the territory to become yours after a war is to annex it and declare it yours. And the only way for it to actually become yours is if you get international recognition, which means that we can make the argument, well, listen, we need the Golan Heights to protect ourselves, but the world has to agree. And they have yet to do so. Okay? Guys, what we decided to do was hold on to this territory. We did. We held on to it, we waited. We annexed one territory in 1967, the northern, southern, and eastern parts of Jerusalem. And we redrew the municipal lines here in Jerusalem, and we then had to offer citizenship to all the people living on the eastern part of the city. We did. They almost unanimously rejected it. So we gave them the status of permanent resident in Jerusalem. What that means, guys, is that they have all the same rights that I do as an Israeli citizen, except for 2. They cannot vote in national elections, but they can vote in municipal elections, but they don't. About 5%, up to 5% are the only ones who vote. And the second thing they do not have is a passport. They have what they call laissez-passer, which are travel documents that they use. But because those travel documents are issued by an actual recognized country, it's a lot easier to travel with them than, for example, the travel documents issued by the Palestinian Authority today. We waited. Guys, there were some people in this country who didn't want to wait. There were some people in this country who didn't want to exchange land for peace. They looked at specific territories and they said, we need to take this territory. This is Jewish land and it should remain Jewish land. What am I talking about? The settlement movement. And the settlement movement will be born, what they called Gush Emunim, the block of the faithful, who will now push for Jewish settlement specifically in the West Bank, but we will also see the growth of Jewish settlements in the Sinai, in the Gaza Strip eventually, and up in the Golan Heights. Guys, the 1970s, we go through a lot of terrorism. We go through another war in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And the Yom Kippur War doesn't change anything territorial, guys. The Syrians and the Egyptians attack us on Yom Kippur. We fight back. We successfully win. We lose a lot more people, which was our lesson of arrogance. To not be arrogant and to not feel invincible, because you're not. But it sent a much clearer message to Egypt. There was a new president in place. His name was Anwar Sadat, and he was way more moderate than his predecessor, Gamal Abdel Nasser. And after that war, after losing 15,000 Egyptian soldiers, he began a peace process. Quietly. Started with Yitzhak Rabin, Henry Kissinger doing shuttle diplomacy. And then in 1977, we have the Mahapach here in Israel, the big flip, when the right-wing government takes over for the first time under the guise of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin continues the peace talks with Anwar Sadat, and in 1979, we sign a peace agreement with the Egyptians. Israel commits itself to withdrawing entirely from the Sinai Peninsula, returning that territory to the Egyptians to make peace. We do. In a phased process, over 3 years, Israel will eventually have full withdrawal from the territory. Why 3 years? Well, because 2 years in, Anwar Sadat was assassinated. For a lot of reasons, one of them being making peace with Israel. And we needed to make sure that the new president, Hosni Mubarak, would hold that peace. And he did. And 50 years later, guys, this year we will be celebrating 50 years of peace and recognition with the Egyptians. Many people thought countries would follow suit. If the Egyptians can do it, other countries could do it too. Guys, the Arab world turned on the Egyptians. They expelled students who were studying abroad. All sorts of backlash against the Egyptians. And then Anwar Sadat's assassinated. So nobody wants to follow in his footsteps. It takes another 15 years for us to make peace with another Arab country. And that's going to be the Jordanians in 1994. Now, guys, in 1979, Israel did not withdraw from Gaza. The Egyptians did not ask for Gaza back. They said, we don't want it anymore. And in 1994, when we made peace with the Jordanians, they also did not ask for land back. They had already relinquished their claim to the West Bank back in 1988. Why? Because of a new population that had been born in these territories. A population that now referred to themselves as Palestinians. And they said they're not Egyptians and they're not Jordanians. They should have Palestinian autonomy in these areas. And now, guys, a new conflict has emerged. Everything we've talked about up until now is what we would dub the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now we're in a different one, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So now we have to talk about Palestinians. I have to stress something before I go into this. Guys, much of this conflict is a conflict of narratives. And we've learned the Jewish narrative. We've been raised with it. To truly understand this conflict, you have to understand the Palestinian narrative. I'm not going to stand here and try to tell it to you. And the reason for that is simple. It's not my story. And no matter how much I know it, and I know it, and I know it very well, I will never be able to do it justice. Which is why later today, you will hear the Palestinian narrative from a Palestinian himself. I can't do it. But what I will share with you is the Palestinian story, that timeline, how they became a people, what happened from a general perspective. So, we talked about Pan-Arabism, this general idea of Arab nationalism that existed throughout the Arab world starting in the early 20th century. Then comes 1948. And the Arabs of Palestine, guys, who remember at this point are tribal, suffer a collective experience. They dubbed it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Because for them, they lost their homes, they lost their land, and they are now refugees. At this point, they're going to start to unite. Because it doesn't matter that you're from one tribe and I from another tribe. We just suffered a collective loss. And we need to get together. And slowly but surely, they're going to form a national identity called Palestinian. Now, organizations are going to form to help usher this along. The first one is Fatah in 1959. But most importantly, it will be the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in 1964. The PLO, guys, will bring them together. Create Palestinian nationalism. The idea that we're now pushing for a state. In the beginning, where was that state? From the river to the sea, historic Palestine will be free. They're not talking about the West Bank and Gaza, guys, to a certain extent. Yeah, maybe. We'll get that from Jordan and in Egypt. But at this time, they're talking about what is Israel proper. Notice, it is 3 years before 1967. Comes 1967, an occupation begins. Because now Israel has taken over territory where Palestinians live, the West Bank and Gaza. Now, I said I was going to get back to that word. The territory itself, guys, it's very hard to make the argument that it's occupied. Occupied territory means that there is one clear sovereign over a territory, and another entity, foreign entity, came in and occupied that territory. Who is the sovereign over the West Bank today?
Depends which part.
No, it doesn't. It's a trick question. There's nobody. Who was the last sovereign over the West Bank? The British. The Jordanians annexed it, but it was never recognized. The Jordanians had control. They never had sovereignty. And then the final question today is, who's today fighting over the West Bank? Israelis and Palestinians. Has either one ever been sovereign over this territory in modern times? No. So my question would be, who is occupying the territory from who? Which is why there is an insistence to call this territory disputed territory and not occupied territory. Because it is disputed. Two people have never been sovereign, both disputing over it. Now, that being said, when we talk about occupation, we have to understand that while the territory itself might not be occupied, the way that the territory is governed and administered by the Israeli military is the laws of a belligerent occupation. And the people living there, who are not Israeli citizens because they do not live in Israel, live under Israeli military occupation from 1967 until the mid-1990s. Now, guys, what does that mean? That means that we, as the occupying power, are responsible for healthcare, education, infrastructure. We have to take care of them. Do we? 100%. And there is no denying this, guys. The quality of life in the West Bank and Gaza rose dramatically after 1967. There was not one major university in these territories prior to 1967. There are now over 9 major universities in the West Bank and 7 in Gaza. Hospitals were built. Schools were built. The entire road system in the West Bank was built under Israeli occupation. It was our responsibility. I'm not saying we're great. We did what we were supposed to do. Now, that being said, we were also actively engaged in counterterrorism the entire time, which means that as a Palestinian, you could be being taken care of, healthcare, education, all that stuff, but if we suspect something, we could also show up in the middle of the night, pull you out of your bed, and take you out to a tent and interrogate you all night. And guys, in the 70s and the 80s, we tortured people. So their experience under Israeli occupation could be good, could also be very negative. And you're going to remember the negative way more than you're going to remember the positive. We can't forget that. 20 years of incitement, of terrorism that Israel's dealing with, of this reality. Comes 1987, Hamas is born. Why? In those universities that we created, there was an Islamatization that happened, and Islamic organizations formed. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas comes up as a rival to the PLO, who's, by the way, secular. And there's a lot of incitement. And that brings about, guys, the first big uprising by Palestinians, the First Intifada. And the First Intifada, guys, where they start to go after us, rioting, shooting, stabbing, sends a message to Israel. You have to deal with this population. They're living under your control. Get it together. And guys, they go to the UN in 1988 and say, we want a state. And that was the moment that the world and Israel said, you know what, might be time to start negotiating with the Palestinians as an independent people. What do they want in negotiations? 3 core demands. The first one is the right of return. We spoke about this already. Guys, today there are 5.4 million refugees. So when we talk about the right of return, as Israelis, we have an innate problem with this. Why? Guys, real quick, write these demographics down. There are 6.4 million Jews who live in Israel. There are 2 million Arabs in Israel. In the Gaza Strip, there are 2 million. And in the West Bank, there's 2.5 million. If we were to absorb 5.4 million Arabs into Israel, what would happen? we wouldn't be a Jewish majority anymore. Sometimes, guys, abroad, the right of return is code for Israel not existing anymore. They know those numbers just as much as I know those numbers. And so when somebody demands a right of return to Israel, the response is, we cannot have that as a reality. Because what you're saying is that their right of return supersedes my right to self-determination into a state. And it doesn't, because I actually have the right to self-determination, and they do not actually have a legal right of return. Yes?
Those last figures, were they from the West Bank and Gaza?
2 million in Gaza, 2.5 million in the West Bank.
For Palestine?
Yes. And some of those are refugees. They're part of that 5.4 million. I just wanted you to have all the numbers. So guys, the right of return is a non-starter. It's impossible to achieve and a Jewish state existing at the same time, okay? The second is land. Now, some are still extremes. Arab rejectionism from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. Then you've got those who have become more moderate, who say a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Two-state solutioners, okay? And the last part is Jerusalem. The Palestinians today, guys, demand that Jerusalem be their capital, the eastern part of the city. But they double down. They also demand that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Temple Mount that it sits on, falls under their sovereignty. Now, this is the third holiest site in Islam, but it's also the first holiest site in Judaism. Guys, sometimes it's not that surprising that we haven't been able to make peace. Both sides are being asked to compromise something so core to who they are. On their side, it's the right of return. Guys, this is an ethos for them. They became a people when they became refugees. And they've passed this down generation to generation. And then on our side, Jerusalem. We are being asked to sacrifice something that's so core to our peoplehood, our capital, for 3,000 years. How are we going to bridge the divide? Well, we tried. It started first in Oslo in the 1990s. Guys, the Oslo peace process was a 5-year peace process. The idea was, over these 5 years, let's sign different agreements, and by the end, we will hammer out all the final status issues: borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, etc. So what happened in Oslo? First of all, the Palestinians will get a government for the first time in history, the Palestinian Authority. They will have elections, and the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, will now be elected as the president of the Palestinian Authority, with his Fatah party leading in the parliament. This allows Israel to now withdraw from territory. They're demanding land. We have to give up land. That was the idea. So Israel now will remap out the West Bank and Gaza, pulling out of major Palestinian city centers and giving it entirely over to the Palestinian Authority. Meaning, guys, that by the 1990s, what you're going to have is now not full-blown occupation anymore, but quasi-occupation. Because now, if you're a Palestinian living in Ramallah, you've now voted for your own government, which is the PA, and in your city, your healthcare, your education, all that is now being provided by the Palestinian Authority, not this foreign power, Israel. Okay? So we pulled out of major city centers. That will then become known as Area A. We then pulled out civilly from the smaller rural towns and villages. That area will become known as Area B. So civilly, healthcare, infrastructure, all that stuff, PA, but there will still be Israeli security presence, military presence in that area. And the last area, vast majority of the West Bank, 60% of it, will become known as Area C. These are the uninhabited lands, the major roadways in the West Bank, and Jewish settlements that today take up about 2% of West Bank territory. But if you include the areas that are still under their control that aren't built up, that number rises to almost 10%. Okay? Guys, these were good steps, you could argue. If you believe in a two-state solution, or you believe even just in Palestinian self-government, not a full-blown state, this is how we were going to get there. But then Oslo fell apart. In Israel, we experienced a massive increase in terrorism and violence. And that led Israelis, whose buses were blowing up and restaurants were blowing up, to pull back and say, was this really the right step? Why are we giving up land? We're only getting more violence. And there was a lot of incitement against the left-wing government of Yitzhak Rabin at the time, who tried to make peace. And one person took that incitement to a disgusting place, where he then assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995. Probably one of the sadder moments in Israeli history. We continued peace talks after Rabin's death, 96, 97, we kept going. But on the other side, Palestinians start to become more and more disillusioned. Why? Well, because now they're supposed to be taken care of by the PA. But is the PA doing their job? No. The PA almost instantly becomes corrupt, guys. They get aid from the world, and where does that aid go? Into the pockets of the top guys in the PA. Yasser Arafat becomes a very rich man. His top cronies start to build villas, and the people don't see any of it. So they get frustrated with the whole process, and who do they turn and run right into the open arms of? Hamas, the rival of Fatah. Why? Because Hamas fills in their shoes. They're building schools, they're building hospitals, they're giving people jobs. They're saying we're the alternative to Fatah. And people buy into it, guys. But what else is Hamas other than a social welfare organization at the time? They're a terrorist organization, a radical terrorist organization. So while, yes, they're taking care of people, they also begin a process of radicalization. And guys, it's easy after Oslo. It's a lot easier than it was before. You know why? Because Oslo created separation for the first time. From 1967, guys, until the mid-1990s, Israel had control over the whole area. So Israelis and Palestinians knew each other. They encountered each other on the beaches, in restaurants. We would go and travel freely into Ramallah or into Bethlehem. And then all of a sudden, now there's Palestinian areas and there's Israeli areas. And slowly but surely, as terrorism grows, we are more and more separated from each other. And guys, today, the reality is that a generation was born into this world, the Oslo generation, of Israelis who can grow up their entire adolescent lives never meeting a Palestinian. And maybe the only Palestinian that they're going to encounter or hear about is going to be a terrorist, the most extreme among them. And on the other side, Palestinians can grow up their entire adolescent lives never meeting an Israeli, except for one kind, a soldier with a gun who scares them, who they're told through the incitement in their mosques and in their schools from their government that we are their enemy, that we are there to oppress them. Not that we're there to protect ourselves from the violence coming from within your society, but the other way around. Guys, we now live in that status quo. 25 years later, that's still the reality. Our perception of them and their perception of us has been entirely skewed as a result of this. And we've gotten further and further apart. So Oslo dies. But a leader steps up in the late 1990s. His name was Ehud Barak, and he ran on a platform of, I'm going to try to make peace. He takes office, and a peace process begins for a final agreement. Started in the middle of the year 2000 in Camp David. And an offer was put on the table. And within 6 months, that offer turns into something called the Clinton parameters. And it includes 94% of the West Bank with a 3% land swap. What that means is we're going to pull out of 94% of the territory. We're going to take 6%. That's where the major settlement blocks are. We're going to give you back some of that land in Israeli territory. That's called a land swap, 3% of it. We'll give you all of Gaza. And guys, the kicker of this is that in any territory that we were going to withdraw from entirely, we were also going to kick out every last Jew from that territory, because that is a demand of the Palestinian Authority. No Jewish Israelis can remain in their state. We said no right of return. Can't do it. It would eliminate the Jewish state. So what can we do? We will give you $30 billion, and you can resettle your refugees in your newly established state. That's the answer. So take your 5.4 million, many of them already live in the West Bank and Gaza, get the rest, bring them in, and resettle them properly in your own country, not in Israel. And then lastly, the kicker, you can have a capital in Jerusalem. The eastern part of the city will be yours. And then when pushed by Clinton, the parameters eventually got to Ehud Barak saying, if the last thing I have to give him is the Temple Mount, I'll do it. Clinton said, give him the Mount. He won't be able to dig. Subterranean, that'll be yours. But they can have sovereignty over the Mount. Yasser Arafat said no. He walked away from the table in the summer. He walked away again in September. And he walked away in January. And during that 6-month period, he started the worst wave of terrorism that Israel had ever seen. The Second Intifada. Guys, this period was the hardest period that we've gone through. where the average Israeli living in a major city felt that their life was threatened almost on a daily basis. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered, 7,500 injured, maimed, people lost limbs. How did it manifest? Suicide bombings, stabbings, shootings, massive rock throwing that oftentimes could be fatal. The numbers don't do it justice. And just talking about it doesn't do it justice. To truly understand it, guys, is to get into the head of an Israeli. To get into the head of somebody who lived through it and the psychology that they went through. I was a 13-year-old kid at the time, and I was living here in Jerusalem. And the city was hit with 600 terrorist attacks. And so I don't want to talk to you about that. I want to talk to you about the psychology. I went through 3 predominant emotions. The first one was fear, naturally. Terror breeds terror. And when the restaurant that you eat at, like Sbarro, was blown up, it instills fear in you. When the shuk that you go and shop in on a weekly basis gets blown up 15 times by suicide bombers, yeah, the fear increases. Guys, fear to the extent that you live your life with the knowledge that in any day you could lose your life. You live your life knowing that when you leave your house, you better tell your parents that you loved them, and they'll say it back just in case that's the last thing you hear each other say. I, as a 14-year-old, went and I would get on my bus to school, and I chose my seat on the bus based on where I thought I was most likely to survive if a suicide bomber got on my bus. Shar, go to the back. They usually build themselves up in the front or in the middle. Go to the back. And I'd go to the back of the bus, and I'd sit there, and the second state of mind would kick in. Hypervigilance. Didn't matter how old you were. You paid attention to everything that was going on around you. So I couldn't sit on that bus and did what I normally did, which was read. I love to read. I always have a book on me. Couldn't read, couldn't play Snake on my ghetto fabulous Nokia phone. I had to pay attention. Because if a guy got on my bus and it was the summer in Jerusalem and he was wearing a big puffy coat, I better notice. Because underneath that coat, he could be hiding a suicide bomb. He walks in and he starts reaching into his coat, that's my cue, and I have a second to duck. And maybe, just maybe, if he's about to blow himself up, that act of me ducking might save my life. It did for a kid on a bus here in Jerusalem. A bus that I missed by 10 minutes. I was on the bus before. Bomber got on, he spotted him, he ducked, he survived. 19 people around him were murdered that day on that same bus. It was the same bombing that's going to prompt the construction of the security barrier, and we'll hear that story when we go on tour. Guy gets on the bus with a backpack, walks to the middle of the bus, puts the bag down, goes and sits down, and a couple stops later, he gets off the bus, but the bag is still there. You better notice. Because that guy might have just left a bomb on your bus. Guys, this was day to day. You're out in the streets, you're paying attention. You find yourself in a crowd, you get the hell out of that crowd because you just became a target. I used to sit around with my friends, and when we watched people gather around us, we would literally comment out loud to each other, guys, we are a target, we have to get out of here. It wasn't subconscious, it was incredibly conscious. This was our environment. And then came the last part. People were dying. And it got very frustrating to watch people burying family members and children on the news. Sbarro, 5 family members of the same family murdered. Their kids orphaned. You get frustrated. You get angry. And guys, for some people, that anger turned into hatred of the Palestinians of the other side. And it usually took that last jump when you knew somebody who was killed. And the sad reality, guys, is in this conflict, almost every Israeli knows somebody killed or injured in a terrorist attack or in war. And during the Intifada, it was almost impossible to get through without. I remember the day that I started to hate Palestinians a little bit more. It was the day a suicide bomber walked up to a group of my friends and blew himself up. It was the next morning when I found out that 2 of my friends had been murdered. It was that week when I learned more about the attack and I learned that the bomber had packed his bomb with nails and screws. I saw them embedded in the walls of the pizza shop. And then I imagined them embedded in the body of my friend Karen, who died because of that shrapnel. Or my friend Rachel, who suffered 1 nail wound to the head lodged in her brain and died of her wounds 10 days later. And as a 14-year-old kid, guys, I couldn't process that. I couldn't process how somebody does that. How do you walk up to a group of kids, look them in the face, and know that you're about to murder some of them? And how the hell am I supposed to make peace with the people who are okay with that? Hatred is very oftentimes, or never, pretty much taught here in Israel. But during the Intifada, it was developed. A lot of people developed it because of experiences that they went through. And I think it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. I gotta stress, guys, I don't hate Palestinians anymore. You're about to meet one of my friends who's a Palestinian himself. But it took me a long time to get to a place where I could feel empathy for these people again. And I know Israelis who still have yet to get to that place. They come up to me and they say, I get where you're coming from, but they murdered my best friend, and I will never forgive them for it. And as far as I'm concerned, they're our enemy, and we have to deal with them however we need to deal with them. We have to understand the different perspectives that we have here in Israel, and many of them are rooted in this time period. We walked out of the Intifada, guys, with anger, animosity, frustration, and no trust in the Palestinians. But what did they go through? How did they see the Second Intifada? First of all, how did it start for them? Totally different than how it started for us. They say, your prime minister or future prime minister, Ariel Sharon, went up to the Temple Mount and tried to basically declare Israeli sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Never happened. He walked and he took a stroll on the Temple Mount. Now, he is one of the most hated guys amongst Palestinians. And it caused a riot. And they literally protested and rioted, throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails, and the Temple Mount that day turned into a riot. And Palestinians were killed on the Temple Mount that day. And it then bled into the streets. October, November, you had riots manifesting daily in the West Bank and Gaza. And guys, you see the numbers. You think we're the only ones who've lost people? Just like us, every Palestinian knows somebody killed or injured, or somebody who is sitting in an Israeli jail. And I say that because we have to understand how personal this conflict is on both sides, and how we see it one way and they see it a different way. And what they saw during these years was that we were murdering their kids. What did we see? We saw riots that were oftentimes spurred on by terrorist organizations. And what they did in these riots was very strategic. They recruited young kids, 12-year-old, 14-year-old boys, and they put them right in the front of the line. And they had them throwing rocks. But behind them, what did they have? The Molotov cocktail throwers. And behind them, the guys shooting. And in the building, snipers. And you're an Israeli soldier. And you're standing in front of this riot. And you start taking live fire. And you feel that your life is in immediate danger. What do? You shoot back. Who are you most likely to kill first? The innocent kids in the front of the row. People started burying their children. It's personal on both sides. They've been taught to hate in a classroom for much of their upbringing. Now we gave them a reason to hate us. What if you weren't active? What if you didn't participate in any of this? What if you were just a Palestinian trying to live your life during the Intifada? Well, now you had to deal with Israeli security, which, guys, was like TSA on steroids. And imagine going through the airport every single day. And imagine that at the time, we didn't really know how much we were doing, and what we were doing was right. It was a lot of trial and error. Nobody had faced terrorism like this before. So we were writing the book on how to deal with it. So what did we do first? We eliminated freedom of movement. You now cannot travel freely in the West Bank or Gaza. You want to travel from place to place, what are you going to go through? An Israeli security checkpoint. And we are going to check everybody and everything. From our perspective, why? Because terrorists use everybody and everything. They used kids. They'd say to kids, here's 50 shekel, take this magazine of bullets for a gun and get it to the other side of the checkpoint. So we had to check every child, every adult, every elderly. We had to check ambulances. The day we discovered that a suicide bomb made its way into Israel on an ambulance and killed 15 people was the day that we put out the order. Every ambulance gets checked. You're sitting there going, totally justified. Now flip your perspective and be a Palestinian for a second. You leave your house, you want to go to school, you want to go to work, you want to go farm your field. You will find yourself crossing through maybe 2, 3, 4 checkpoints to get there. You're going to wait in a super long line because we're checking everybody. And you watch as an ambulance pulls up to that checkpoint, and you watch as they stop it and they pull somebody out of the back of the ambulance who literally could be dying. And then you watch as they take their time searching that ambulance. How are you going to feel about Israelis? Because as far as I'm concerned, from my angle, they look evil. Who does that? What's the right question? Not who checks ambulances. What's the right question? Who uses ambulances for terrorist activity? But they don't know. They don't hear those reports. They're thinking these people are evil. And they're doing this just to oppress us. And then they get to the front of the line, guys. And what might they find? A really nice Israeli soldier. Treats them well, dignity, respect, does his job, upstanding guy, right? Or a piece of garbage. A kid who's 18 years old, who maybe is on a power trip, thinks it's funny to harass and humiliate people, and he gets a kick out of it, gets his jollies off. So he bullies them a little bit, harasses them. Imagine you're a kid. You're standing there with your father and you're watching him get harassed by this 18-year-old, shaming him. How are you going to feel about Israelis? You might find a guy who's angry. I understand. You're watching people die every day in your cities. You're standing there, you're angry, you're facing these people every day. Yeah, sure, maybe you take your anger out on them a little bit. But for them, guys, it's not you just taking your anger out. It's you dehumanizing them. It's you stripping them of their dignity. And that's how they feel. Checkpoints. At nighttime curfews, can't leave your house past a certain time or we're going to assume that you're a terrorist. So now during the day, you don't have freedom of movement. At night, you're a prisoner in your own home. Then we decided on 2 other measures. Nothing was working. 2002, we decided to construct a security barrier, our last defensive measure. Put up a barrier, stopping them in their tracks. What else did we do? We went on the offense. In April of 2002, we launched Operation Defensive Shield, where we sent our forces back into the major cities that we had withdrew from during the Oslo peace process. We went into Bethlehem. We went into Ramallah. We went into Jenin. We sent our forces back in, tanks rolling through their cities, guys. And what do they now feel? Full-blown military occupation yet again. And they're under siege. That's how they feel. And then we say, we got to get better. And at this point, we are going to start to try to gather as much intelligence as possible. And eventually, guys, we're going to start to see a reduction of terrorism. And most of our operations today in the West Bank, this is how they go. We get intelligence, and we don't wait for them to come to us at a checkpoint. We go to them. Nightly, what we are doing today, guys, is we go into Area A, into refugee camps, into the cities, and we arrest terrorists. So no more checkpoints. There are almost no checkpoints today in the middle of the West Bank. You could drive throughout the West Bank today and almost never encounter an Israeli soldier. Maybe on the roads you'll see them, but you won't have to face them face to face. But if you're a terrorist or you live next door to a terrorist, you're going to hear those operations. And again, guys, with everything we do, there's going to be a drawback. So there's house arrest, right? So we go into a house and, you're, let's say, a 9-year-old kid and you're sound asleep in your bed and you get woken up by Israeli soldiers storming into your house, grabbing you out of your bed, putting you aside with your siblings and your mother as you watch Israeli soldiers take your father away. Now, guys, for us, I get it. Your father's a terrorist. We're doing what we got to do. But for you, he's your hero. He's your best friend. And these people who you've been raised to hate your entire life are now taking him away. How are you going to feel about Israelis? Again, you've been taught to hate. Now you have a reason to. What are the chances that that kid's going to become a terrorist? Much higher. With every measure that we've taken, there will be drawbacks. But that's what we do today. But guys, these years left an indelible mark on Palestinians. They felt like we were choking them. And they felt like we were dehumanizing them. Have we gotten better? Yes. But did this leave a mark? Absolutely. The Second Intifada left a mark on all of us. So let's wrap up by what's going on today. We still tried to make peace. During those years, Bush takes office. He says, make peace. Pull out of Gaza first. We'll have a peace process. It's called the roadmap. Israel pulls out of Gaza. We talked about that. Pulled out of Gaza. Hamas takes over. More rockets, more violence. What did we learn? Maybe withdrawing from territory without a final agreement doesn't work. That's what we learned from Gaza. But then, what we also learned was that Fatah, the now new leader, Mahmoud Abbas, taken over after Yasser Arafat dies, he now has an interest in working with Israel. because he's sitting pretty in the West Bank while Hamas is in control of Gaza. But is Hamas trying to take control in the West Bank also? Absolutely. And he wants to maintain his power. So what does he do in 2007-8? Palestinian security forces start to cooperate with Israel. And they tell us when there are Hamas terrorists, and we go and we arrest them. And then came another peace agreement, another attempt by our new Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who takes over when Ariel Sharon has a stroke in January of 2006. He puts a deal on the table for Mahmoud Abbas. All of Gaza, we already pulled out. 96% of the West Bank with a 4% land swap. A bridge to connect the two territories so that they would be contiguous. A right of return for Palestinian refugees into their country using the money that we would give them, and, by the way, a limited right of return into Israel for some refugees. And the kicker, Jerusalem as their capital. Mahmoud Abbas never called him back. We never got a rejection to this offer. We just never got an answer. And the offer left, off the table. We then fought 3 major operations in Gaza against Hamas, again reinforcing the idea of can we actually pull out of the West Bank without creating more violence and more war. I got to flip this quickly. And then we have the era of preconditions. New leadership takes office. Here in Israel, we have Bibi Netanyahu. In the States, we have Barack Obama. Mahmoud Abbas believes that he has an ally in the White House with Barack Obama. And he says, I'm emboldened. You want me to come to the negotiating table? Every time you ask, I'm going to demand something first. Preconditions. So in 2009, 2010, it was stop building settlements. We did for 10 months. At 9.5 months in, he comes to the table. 2 weeks later, he demanded that we extend our moratorium on settlements. We said no, the government's going to fall apart. He walked away from the table. Peace talks failed. 3 years later, John Kerry steps up. Says, let's renew peace talks. He says, okay, but Israel has to release 100+ prisoners from their jails for me to come to the table and stay at the table. Israel agrees to release 100+ terrorists from our jails. He calls them prisoners. I'm going to call them what they are, guys. Every one of these people murdered somebody. They were terrorists during the First Intifada and into the 1990s. And we did it. And 9 months later, he violated the peace talks by joining international bodies, which was an absolute non-starter. Israel refused to release the last batch of terrorists. Peace talks failed. That was the last time we sat and tried to make peace with Palestinians. Today, the talk that is happening is about Trump's peace plan. I'm not going to get into it, and the reason why is because I don't know what it looks like, and I'm not about to speculate on what it might look like. It will probably be released when Israel forms its new government. We have not had a government since December of this past year, of 2009. We had elections in April. We failed to create another government. So we're going back into elections in September in the hopes that this one works. And hopefully we will manage to form a coalition by hopefully latest November. And once that happens, then maybe the Trump administration could put their plan out into the public. But again, we talked about this. Today, guys, yeah, maybe there are some Israelis who see that the Trump administration might be able to do this, but the Palestinians have adamantly stated that they do not see the Americans at the moment as unbiased moderators for peace. So it might be a non-starter. What has Israel focused on since? Other issues. Hamas in Gaza, the continuous threat that we face from them, the threats that we face from Hezbollah in the north, which is really just a larger looming threat of Iran. And the growing Iranian bloc, the Shiite bloc here in the Middle East, that's growing, and they're getting more emboldened and trying to get stronger and stronger. Positive note, as a result of this, Israel is also really hyper-focusing in on diplomatic relations with Arab countries, which has gotten warmer and warmer as the fight against Iran has gotten stronger and stronger. So we're looking at other things. And we're also looking at the larger problem. Guys, those are physical threats, but there's a larger global threat, and that's the threat of delegitimization. It's why you're sitting in this room. It's why Stand With Us does what it does. Because around the world, everything we just talked about is framed in the wrong way, introduced in the wrong way, or more importantly, just the average person does not understand it. And it feeds this movement that is actively trying to delegitimize Israel with just words. So we're there to fight that fight. That's where we're at today. Thanks, guys.